It's only January, and there's already a video game that everybody is talking about. For the last week, a previously little-known educational game called Pathways has been doing the rounds online, and not because anyone thinks it's good, it's being ridiculed and dissected and increasingly described as propaganda, largely because it comes across as tone-deaf, clumsy and fundamentally wrong-headed. One of the clearest problems is that it repeatedly conflates ordinary political disagreement with hate speech, depicting scenarios where questioning immigration levels or expressing concern about immigrants taking job positions is treated as an early warning sign of extremism. In several cases, characters aren't flagged for advocating violence or criminal behaviour, but simply for voicing scepticism about immigration policy or engaging in contentious online debates. These moments are then framed as pathways towards radicalisation, unless they are immediately challenged or reported, collapsing legitimate democratic discussion into something suspicious and dangerous. What makes this especially troubling is that Pathways is state-funded in the UK and explicitly designed as a safeguarding resource for children and young people. It was created as an attempt to explain how radicalisation supposedly develops and how it can be prevented. On paper, that sounds sensible. In practice, it raises deeply uncomfortable questions about how dissent is framed, how authority is presented as inherently correct, and whether this is genuinely about preventing violence at all, or about conditioning young people to associate political disagreement with moral failure. So, with that in mind, today I want to talk through what Pathways is supposed to be, why it's being mocked so relentlessly, and why so many people feel it crosses the line from education into something far more ideological. I am Lady Decade, and if you'd like to hear all of the spicy news from the games industry, then hit that subscribe button, as it's time to talk about Pathways, the British propaganda game. Oh, brilliant. It's that miserable stretch of the year again. It's cold outside, the state poking its nose where it doesn't belong, and absolutely no reason to leave the house unless you are apparently attending a patriotic protest. But if you were going to just stay at home, you may as well do it without rinsing your wallet. I've got links in the description to some genuinely good bargains, including Tomb Raider Remastered Trilogy for under a fiver, Stellar Blade at 42% off, Expedition 33 down 48%, and Nier Automata at a hefty 61% off, plus thousands more discounts besides. Using those links helps keep the channel going, which I genuinely appreciate. But if you really love what I do and you'd like to support the ongoing humanitarian effort known as keeping free speech alive in the UK, you can back the show over on Patreon. There you'll get behind the scenes cosplay content, extra bits and bobs, and yes, my brand new shoot as the extremely patriotic Amelia, bravely standing up for diverse thoughts in a hostile media environment. Best of all, there's no TV license required to donate, which frankly makes it the most ethical form of funding available. So, if you fancy doing your civic duty, I'll see you over there. Thank you, Patriots. According to those who have played Pathways, which I actually managed to do too, as it turns out, it's not actually been removed from the internet after all, as I managed to play it just gone 10:30 p.m. on Friday, the 16th of January. And it's very difficult to shake the impression that simply engaging with it feels like you're putting yourself on a watch list. That may sound flippant, but it captures the underlying message that the game gives off. And it goes a long way towards explaining why the public reaction wasn't solemn concern or thoughtful debate, but irritation and mockery. This backlash isn't coming from people who oppose safeguarding, and it certainly isn't coming from anyone looking to excuse extremism. It's coming from people looking at a state-funded educational product aimed at children and asking a far more basic question: what on earth were they thinking? After all, this is a government-endorsed browser game for children paid for with public money under the UK's Prevent programme and distributed through schools as part of mandatory safeguarding frameworks. Taxpayer money went into its development, its approval, and its rollout through official channels that parents and teachers are legally required to engage with. So when the state uses public funds to produce something this clumsy and this patronising and this detached from everyday reality, mockery stops being a sign of bad faith and starts looking like a perfectly rational response. In Pathways, players navigate social media feeds, everyday conversations and political content, all under the heavy-handed implication that the choices they make will determine whether they are drifting towards extremism and in need of intervention. On paper, that premise probably sounded tidy enough to survive a committee meeting, which is almost certainly how it was commissioned, but the reality is, it falls apart almost immediately because the game repeatedly treats ordinary, mainstream political instincts, particularly around immigration, culture and national identity, as though they are functionally indistinguishable from hatred or radicalisation, which quite frankly disgusts me in every sense of the word. Once that framing becomes clear, the entire exercise stops inviting engagement and starts inviting ridicule. The messaging is so blunt, poorly disguised and internally confused that it effectively gives itself away. This isn't a case of bad faith interpretation imposed by critics looking for outrage. It's the unavoidable conclusion drawn from a game where attempting to examine information independently nudges the player deeper towards being labelled an extremist. But as for me, no, I'm not here to endlessly mock a bad game for sport, even though it makes that very tempting, and there are already hundreds of channels doing exactly that. The point here is to explain what Pathways actually is, why anyone thought commissioning it was a good idea, and why it's rubbed so many people all over the world the wrong way, and equally as importantly, what this episode reveals about how the British state currently understands safeguarding, radicalisation, and risk. There is simply too much here to unpack without taking the subject seriously, including how we ended up in this position in the first place. So, let's dig a little deeper. To understand why Pathways failed so comprehensively, you first have to understand what it was trying to do, because the underlying intention isn't nearly as absurd as the final product makes it look. As already mentioned, the game was designed as an educational tool tied directly to Prevent, but for those of you outside the UK or anyone who's never worked with children or safeguarding frameworks, it's worth pausing to ask a very basic question first. What exactly is Prevent? To cut a long story short, Prevent is the UK's counter-extremism and safeguarding programme, created in the aftermath of 9/11 and later expanded following the 7/7 London bombings in 2005. Its stated purpose is to help identify early warning signs in children and young people who might be vulnerable to radicalisation, particularly through the online spaces, peer influence and exposure to political content. The logic is straightforward enough to sound convincing in a meeting. Identify problems early, intervene early, and ideally prevent something far worse from happening later. Their basic premise isn't especially controversial, and most people instinctively support early intervention when children are involved. When Prevent was first introduced, its focus was relatively narrow and explicit. In the early 2000s, it was primarily aimed at tackling Islamist extremism, reflecting the security concerns of the post-9/11 and post-7/7 periods. The programme was designed to work within schools, local councils and community organisations to identify young people who might be vulnerable to recruitment by jihadist networks, particularly those exposed to online propaganda or operating within insular social environments. This focus wasn't accidental or hidden, it was a direct response to the nature of the attacks the UK had experienced and to the intelligence assessments of the time. In its original form, Prevent was framed less as a broad cultural safeguarding tool and more as a targeted counter-terrorism measure aimed at a very specific and clearly defined national threat. As a result, Prevent was broadly accepted by the public, largely because it aligned with the political mood of the time and addressed a threat most people were recognised as real. There was very little appetite for abstract debates about overreach, and the idea of early intervention to stop radicalisation before it turned violent felt both pragmatic and necessary. Prevent wasn't especially visible to most people, which also limited controversy. It operated largely through institutions rather than public campaigns, and as a result, many simply assumed it was a sensible safeguarding measure doing preventative work in the background. Sure, some opposition did exist, particularly from civil liberties groups and sections of Muslim communities who raised concerns about profiling and trust, but this criticism remained relatively contained and did not reflect wider public sentiment at the time. For most people, Prevent was tolerated, if not outright supported, because it appeared focused, proportionate, and rooted in recent lived experience. While Prevent was designed to deal with the known threat of jihadists who were terrorising the West, things did not stay that way forever. A shift would happen gradually throughout the early mid-2010s, and it was not driven by a single decision, but instead a change in how the state chose to define extremism. The change was following a series of developments: the rise of visible so-called far-right groups in Europe, high-profile lone actor attacks such as Anders Breivik's 2011 massacre in Norway, and later domestic incidents like the 2013 murder of Lee Rigby in Woolwich. Lee Rigby was a British Army soldier who was murdered in a horrendous terrorist attack in May 2013 in southeast London. Rigby, who served with the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers, was attacked off-duty near his barracks by two Islamist extremists who deliberately targeted him purely because he was a soldier, gruesomely murdering him in public at 2:20 in the afternoon, and then attempted to justify the killing as retaliation for British military actions abroad. The attack was filmed and partially broadcast online, making it one of the most shocking and widely seen acts of terrorism in modern British history. At the same time, policymakers became increasingly concerned about online radicalisation more broadly, particularly the idea that individuals could move between ideological ecosystems rather than being recruited by a single organised group. The decisive moment came in 2015 when the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act placed a statutory prevent duty on schools, universities, councils, and other public bodies. From that point on, Prevent was formally reframed to cover all forms of extremism, including far-right ideology, mixed or unclear grievances, and what officials increasingly described as vulnerability to harmful narratives. The rationale was risk management. If radicalisation was understood as a process rather than a destination, then safeguarding could be expanded upstream to capture attitudes, behaviours and beliefs long before violence entered the picture. But this expansion is where consensus began to fracture. What had once been a relatively narrow counter-terrorism tool became a broad preventative framework operating in everyday civic spaces and applied to political expression, identity and belief. Support didn't collapse overnight, but skepticism grew as Prevent's scope widened, its definitions softened, and the line between preventing violence and managing dissent became far less clear. Following the period I've just described, the overwhelming majority of fatal terrorist attacks in the UK have continued to be of Islamist origin, both in terms of successful attacks and disrupted plots. High-profile incidents such as the Westminster Bridge attack, Manchester Arena bombing, the London Bridge attacks, and Parsons Green were all linked to Islamist extremism, and they drove much of the public's continued concern about terrorism. By contrast, while far-right extremism has absolutely existed and has been taken seriously by security services, it has resulted in far fewer completed attacks and deaths in the UK. Cases linked to the far right have more often involved disrupted plots, online activity, or lone individuals intercepted before carrying out violence rather than a sustained pattern of mass casualty attacks. This disparity is where the tension begins to grow. Prevent's widening remit was justified on the basis that radicalisation is a process rather than an ideology, and that All forms of extremism should therefore be treated symmetrically, but when that rhetorical symmetry collided with a reality in which the threat landscape was not symmetrical, many people began to question whether the programme was drifting away from evidence-led counter-terrorism and towards something more abstract. As Prevent expanded further into everyday political expression, identity and belief, the gap between actual patterns of violence and who was being monitored, flagged or safeguarded has become harder to ignore, and the scepticism has hardened accordingly. What makes this even more striking is what Pathways chooses to focus on and what it sidelines. Despite being rooted in a counter-extremism framework that was originally designed in response to Islamist terrorism, the game largely avoids that subject altogether. Instead, its most prominent narrative thread centres on the story of Charlie, a young character framed as drifting towards what the game labels far-right extremism. Players are guided through Charlie's social media use, conversations and political curiosity, with the clear implication that his interest in immigration, national identity and contentious political content places him on a dangerous trajectory. There is no equivalent exploration of Islamist radicalisation, no comparable narrative that reflects the form of extremism that historically prompted Prevent's creation in the first place. The result is a game that presents a highly selective version of Risk, one that treats mainstream political instincts as inherently suspect while avoiding the more complex, uncomfortable realities of Islamist extremism entirely. That imbalance reveals how safeguarding logic has drifted away from responding to concrete threats and towards managing perceptions, attitudes and beliefs. By asking children to role-play a scenario where curiosity about immigration policy or engagement with controversial opinions nudges them closer to intervention, Pathways effectively reframes political disagreement as a safeguarding concern. It's not teaching how violent extremism develops, it's teaching which ideas make institutions nervous, and in doing so, it exposes a broader institutional shift, one where the story being told is no longer about preventing violence, but about preemptively policing the boundaries of acceptable thought. The existence of pathways is what happens when policymakers, consultants and safeguarding frameworks translate their assumptions directly into an interactive product and hand it to children under the banner of education. When institutions show you how they think this plainly, especially on an issue this sensitive, it's worth paying attention. Not because you're anti-state, but because you expect public systems to display a basic level of competence. Shout Out UK developed the game. This organisation positions itself around political and media literacy and has worked extensively with government departments and public bodies. It was funded through Prevent and deployed via local authority channels, including Hull City Council and the East Riding of Yorkshire. This is important because it tells you exactly what this is. This was official policy logic filtering down into schools through approved funding streams, wrapped in the language of safeguarding and responsibility, and presented to children not as optional political education but as part of mandatory safeguarding provision they don't get a choice about. Nobody involved thought that they were doing anything controversial. They thought that they were ticking the right boxes and fulfilling a statutory duty in a system terrified of being blamed for the next failure. And now they're at the centre of a political shitstorm. Hull is also worth pausing on for a moment because its inclusion exposes just how untethered this approach has become from any meaningful assessment of risk. The game was reportedly developed in response to protests outside hotels housing migrants, yet Hull itself is significantly more ethnically homogenous than the national average, with a predominantly white British population and a relatively small Muslim community. Whatever one thinks of those protests, they were not acts of terrorism nor evidence of an emerging radical network. They were public demonstrations tied to a highly visible and politically contentious government policy. Treating that context as justification for a counter-extremism intervention aimed at children reveals how far the definition of risk has drifted. If Pathways were responding to a concrete, localised threat of violent radicalisation, Hull would be an odd choice. The fact that it was deployed there anyway suggests the goal was not to address extremism in any meaningful sense, but to preemptively manage attitudes in response to lawful political expression. And that is precisely why Pathways is so revealing. It isn't a one-off embarrassment, it isn't an anomaly. It's a symptom. It shows what happens when safeguarding logic becomes bureaucratised, outsourced and filtered through multiple layers of institutional risk aversion, particularly after the prevent duty was turned into a legal obligation for schools, councils and healthcare providers. Once safeguarding becomes something institutions are required to prove they are doing, rather than something they are expected to apply with judgment, incentives change. At that point, it becomes far safer to respond to abstract, speculative or exaggerated threats than to risk being accused of having missed something real. Hypothetical dangers are easier to model, easier to document and easier to demonstrate action against. You can't be blamed for failing to prevent an event that never existed, but you can be blamed for failing to follow procedure if something goes wrong later. In that environment, it's hardly surprising that systems drift towards managing perceived attitudes and imagined trajectories rather than responding proportionately to actual patterns of violence. The result is a safeguarding culture that becomes preoccupied with risks that are administratively convenient rather than empirically grounded, where appearance of vigilance matters more than its relevance. It's typical bureaucratic nonsense where people get a payday for providing essentially absolutely nothing in return. The original purpose of Prevent is becoming buried under procedures, compliance targets, and an overriding fear of being blamed for the next headline-grabbing failure. You don't need outrage to understand this, just a basic awareness of how large organisations behave when avoiding liability becomes more important than exercising common sense. Now, before any of my beloved American viewers watching this mentally file Prevent away as just a British authoritarian surveillance programme, which, to be fair, it certainly has elements of, it's worth remembering that its original purpose was straightforward: to stop people from becoming terrorists before they carried out acts of violence. It's supposed to be as simple as that. It's not part of a criminal justice process, and it isn't designed to be punitive. Prevent operates through a safeguarding model where concerned adults, teachers, doctors, youth workers and even parents can refer someone they believe may be vulnerable. That referral is assessed initially by counter-terrorism policing and then, where appropriate, by multi-agency channel panels. If intervention is agreed and consent is given, support is offered in the form of counselling, mentoring or specialist guidance, with the stated aim of reducing risk rather than punishing belief. I don't know about you, but I would prefer if people were diverted away from terrorism, especially at a young age, rather than dealt with after the violence has already occurred. The children who are referred are not treated as criminals or even as suspects because they haven't necessarily even broken the law, but they might be showing signs that they need help. Prevent was meant to stop children becoming dangerous adults, never to criminalise them, and in all honesty, that distinction, I think, is really important because it explains why comparisons with America's counter-terror policy are tempting, but incomplete. For a US audience, the closest familiar reference point is the USA Patriot Act. Also passed in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, the Patriot Act dramatically expanded the powers of the US government in the name of counter-terrorism. It lowered the thresholds for surveillance, allowed law enforcement and intelligence agencies to share information more freely, expanded the use of wiretaps and data collection, and enabled the monitoring of financial transactions, communications and online activity, with far less judicial friction than before. The logic was speed and prevention. Remove bureaucratic obstacles so threats could be identified and disrupted before attacks took place. One of the most significant consequences of the USA Patriot Act was how it normalised expansive surveillance powers that quickly extended beyond terrorism. The clearest example came in 2013 when Edward Snowden revealed that the NSA had used Section 215 to collect the phone metadata of millions of ordinary Americans in bulk, regardless of suspicion. Powers intended for exceptional threats became routine tools used by the United States government. The Act also enabled mechanisms like national security letters, allowing authorities to obtain personal records without warrants, while gagging recipients from disclosing them. Over time, these measures had a chilling effect on speech and association. Knowing that communications, reading habits, donations, or online activity could be monitored discouraged people from engaging with controversial ideas, political groups, or sensitive topics. This didn't require active repression. The possibility of scrutiny was often enough. Much like Prevent at the time, the Patriot Act was initially popular. It was introduced during a moment of genuine fear, framed as a necessary response to an unprecedented threat, and widely supported on the assumption that extraordinary times justified extraordinary powers. And like Prevent, controversy didn't centre on its stated aim of preventing terrorism, but on how those powers were later normalised, expanded, and applied far beyond their original scope. Over time, critics argued that measures designed for exceptional circumstances became embedded in everyday governance, raising serious questions about civil liberties, proportionality, and oversight, which is quite important, really, because it helps explain how something introduced with broader public support can slowly drift away from its original intent without ever being formally re-debated. Prevent, in contrast to the Patriot Act, pushes responsibility outwards rather than concentrating it within intelligence agencies. It asks teachers, parents, doctors, and other responsible adults to notice warning signs and raise concerns before harm occurs, framing intervention as safeguarding rather than enforcement. The intent is not supposed to be covert surveillance or intelligence harvesting, but overt support delivered through counselling, mentoring, and structured intervention while behaviour is still malleable and outcomes are not yet fixed. In that sense, Prevent is supposed to be a watered-down civilian-facing version of the same preventative logic. It's meant to be softer, more transparent, and more humane, relying on human judgment and early intervention rather than secret warrants, bulk surveillance, and intelligence trawling. The idea is not to punish individuals, but to step in early while behaviour is still fluid and outcomes are not yet set in stone. On paper, it makes sense. If early intervention works, it should reduce terrorism, lone act of violence, and even school shootings by addressing the social, psychological, and behavioural factors that push people towards violence before they reach a breaking point. Instead of waiting for a manifesto and a body count, the theory is that you intervene early, understand what the driving factor is, and de-escalate while there is still time to change the outcome. Once again, this is where comparisons with the United States become unavoidable. America has no equivalent national safeguarding framework of this kind designed to protect children, and intervention there often only comes after tragedy has already occurred. It's a structural difference, and if Prevent worked as advertised, it would almost certainly save lives. The problem is, though, that Prevent has never always worked as advertised. And its failures are not abstract or hypothetical. One of the most frequently cited failures of the Prevent framework is the case of Shamima Begum, precisely because it involved a genuine, ideologically driven pathway into violent extremism that went undetected until it was too late. Begum was a schoolgirl in East London who consumed ISIS propaganda online, expressed interest in the conflict in Syria, and ultimately travelled there in 2015 to join the group. In hindsight, there were clear indicators of radicalisation, but Prevent did not intervene in any meaningful way prior to her leaving the UK. Concerns were either not escalated, not acted upon decisively, or became lost within the institutional processes that prioritised caution and procedure over judgment. The risk was a stark contradiction. A safeguarding system designed to identify early warning signs failed to engage when the risk was concrete and escalating, even as it would later expand its scope to scrutinise far more ambiguous forms of political expression. The failure of Prevent to intervene effectively becomes even harder to ignore when contrasted with cases involving real, escalating violence. In 2024, Axel Ruda-Kubana, who was 15 years old, carried out a knife attack in Southport that resulted in the murders of 3 little schoolgirls aged between 6 and 9. Crucially, this was not a case that emerged from nowhere. Ruda-Kubana had been reported to authorities prior to the attack, and concerns were already being raised about his behaviour, yet no decisive intervention took place. The attack was not classified as terrorism because it was not linked to a recognised extremist ideology, but it involved extreme, deliberate violence directed at very young little children. In the aftermath, serious questions were asked about why existing safeguarding and risk assessment systems failed to act when warning signs were present. As with other cases, the problem was not the absence of frameworks in theory, but the inability to intervene when risks were concrete, behavioural, and immediate. That contrast is difficult to ignore. While preventative systems struggle to respond to genuine lethal danger, tools like Pathways instead devote their attention to speculative ideological pathways rooted in political curiosity and disagreement. Over time, there's little doubt that Prevent has drifted away from its original narrow focus on violent extremism and expanded into a much broader and far less precise area of vulnerability. In recent years, a significant proportion of Prevent referrals have involved individuals where no ideology, no terrorism risk, and no credible threat was ultimately identified at all. At the same time, the balance of referrals has steadily shifted away from Islamist extremism towards far more loosely defined categories of so-called extreme right-wing concern. That expansion may sound compassionate and preventative in policy documents, but in practice, it creates noise, and safeguarding systems live or die on clarity. When suspicion is spread too widely, genuine danger becomes harder to distinguish, and when everything is treated as a red flag, nothing truly stands out. Pathways is what that failure looks like when it's translated into a game and handed to children. In its world, questioning immigration is treated as a warning sign, patriotism is visually coded as extremism, and disagreement is reframed as a psychological issue rather than a political one. The player is steadily funneled towards intervention outcomes regardless of intent or context, creating the impression that Prevent involvement isn't a response to dangerous behaviour at all, but an almost automatic consequence of curiosity, scepticism, or dissent. By this point, you have to ask yourself, what the hell does this have to do with counter-terrorism? For example, in one scenario, the player encounters a claim circulating online about preferential access to housing, presented in a way that mirrors arguments people encounter in real political debates every single day. Rather than encouraging the player to check sources, look at data, or weigh competing explanations, the game treats engagement with the question itself as suspicious. The game doesn't encourage children to question things and develop media literacy. The game is produced to condition them. It teaches them that examining controversial claims is itself a problem, even when those claims may be exaggerated, partially true, or legitimately worth interrogating. The result is that the game collapses its own moral framework, and what's most hilarious of all is that the supposed villain doesn't come across as dangerous or threatening, but as recognisable and oddly reasonable, which is why the character Amelia was instantly turned into a meme, representing resistance to institutional overreach rather than the cautionary example the designers clearly intended.
Brits are famously polite, but it mustn't mean we're willing to commit cultural suicide.
To many, it seems that they have accidentally written Amelia as very likeable because she displays qualities most people instinctively recognise as normal and healthy: curiosity, scepticism, and a willingness to ask obvious questions, and an ability to notice when official explanations don't quite add up. She isn't depicted as aggressive, conspiratorial, or fixated on violence. In fact, she doesn't talk about harming anyone, nor does she express hatred towards specific groups. Instead, she voices concern in plain language, responds rationally to what she sees around her, and reacts in a way that mirrors how many ordinary people would respond to contentious political issues. In other words, she behaves like a citizen, not a threat. By positioning those traits as indicators of danger, the game accidentally inverts its own moral logic. The player isn't watching a descent into extremism, they're watching a character articulate doubts that feel grounded, proportionate, and familiar. That's why Amelia didn't register as a warning sign to audiences, but as a stand-in for anyone who's ever felt talked down to by institutions insisting they know best. When a safeguarding narrative treats reasonableness itself as suspect, it shouldn't be surprising that viewers side of the character being flagged rather than the system doing the flagging. When a state-funded safeguarding tool aimed at children ends up encouraging sympathy for the character it's supposed to warn against and turns institutional overreach into the punchline, the problem isn't public misunderstanding, it's design failure. The game doesn't provoke reflection or caution, it invites recognition. And once that recognition became widespread, leaving it publicly accessible stopped it being defensible.
Chav, posh, doesn't matter. We're already all in this together.
If this were just a bad educational product, it would be embarrassing and forgettable. The problem is that it isn't. We have real-world examples of Prevent failing at precisely the thing it was created to do. Axel Rudakabana received repeated Prevent referrals during adolescence, documented behavioural warning signs, and assessments concluded intervention was unnecessary, despite escalating concerns, before he went on to commit an act of extreme violence. Instead, when safeguarding systems treat ordinary citizens as suspects by default, they corrode the trust they depend on to function at all. Teachers become cautious informants rather than educators. Parents become anxious about how their children's opinions will be interpreted at school. Communities disengage rather than cooperate. Over time, this weakens the very social cohesion that makes early intervention possible, replacing shared responsibility with suspicion and box ticking. Prevent fails the moment. It conflates mainstream political concern with extremism, over-refers low-risk cases, and alienates the very adults it relies on to notice genuine danger. A system that cannot reliably tell the difference between disagreement and threat will fail at both. Now, all of what we've discussed today is very heavy, so why not soothe your soul by treating yourself to some genuinely good bargains, including Tomb Raider Remastered Trilogy for under a $5, Stellar Blade at 42% off, Expedition 33 down 48%, and Nier Automata at a hefty 61% off, plus thousands more discounts besides. Using those links helps keep the channel going, which I genuinely appreciate, and if you really love what I do and would like to go one step further by supporting the ongoing humanitarian effort otherwise known as keeping free speech alive in the UK, you can also back the show over on Patreon. Over there you'll get behind the scenes cosplay content, extra bits and bobs, and yes, my brand new shoot as the extremely patriotic Amelia, bravely defending a diverse thought in a hostile media environment. So, if you do your civic duty, and I'll see you over there. Thank you, Patriots, and as always, thanks for watching.